Massacre Bay, Attu Island. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Hartle crouches in a landing craft as freezing spray slashes across his face. Around him, 3,000 American soldiers grip their rifles with numb fingers while their transport pitches in 12-foot swells. Through the fog, Hartle can barely see the volcanic slopes of Attu rising like a fortress from the Bering Sea. Somewhere in that fog, 2,500 Japanese defenders wait in bunkers carved into frozen mountainsides. This morning, Hartle and his men will execute America's first opposed amphibious landing in the Pacific Theater. Within 19 days, this frozen island would witness one of World War II's bloodiest small battles and America's only ground combat fought on its own soil since the Civil War. The Aleutian campaign has been called the Forgotten War, but what happened in these frozen islands would reshape American amphibious doctrine and cost both sides a price measured not just in blood, but in frostbite, madness, and men who simply vanished into the tundra. The question is simple. Why did two modern armies fight to the death over a chain of volcanic rocks where even summer temperatures barely reach 50 degrees? The story begins 6 months earlier, on June 3, 1942, when Japanese carriers launched the only aerial attack on the North American continent during World War II. While the world watched Midway, Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's carrier strike force hammered Dutch Harbor in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. Zeros and Kates screamed over fuel tanks and barracks, killing 43 Americans and destroying millions of dollars in infrastructure. But the attack was a feint. The real objective lay 800 miles west, where Japanese forces were about to seize American soil for the first time since 1812. On June 7, 1942, 2,400 Japanese troops splashed ashore on Kiska Island without opposition. The same day, 1,200 more landed on Attu, America's westernmost outpost. The garrison consisted of exactly 45 people, 10 U.S. Navy weathermen and 35 Aleut villagers. Within hours, the Japanese controlled both islands. The Navy men on Attu were shipped to brutal POW camps in Japan, where half would die. The Aleuts faced internment under harsh conditions. And suddenly, the American flag no longer flew over a piece of incorporated U.S. territory. The seizure sent shockwaves through Washington and created a strategic dilemma that would consume resources desperately needed elsewhere. The Aleutian chain stretches 1,100 miles from the Alaska Peninsula toward Japan, like a broken bridge across the North Pacific. Control of these islands meant potential air bases within striking distance of the American mainland, or conversely, stepping stones toward Japan itself. Geography had transformed worthless rocks into strategic prizes. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, faced a difficult calculation. Every ship, plane, and soldier sent to the Aleutians couldn't fight in the South Pacific, where the real war was being decided. Yet leaving Japanese forces on American territory was politically unacceptable and strategically dangerous. Reports indicated, though later proved exaggerated, that Japan might fortify the islands into an unsinkable carrier capable of threatening the west coast or interdicting Lend-Lease convoys to the Soviet Union through the northern route. The numbers told a grim story. The Aleutians offered no natural harbors, no trees, near constant fog that could ground aircraft for weeks, and weather so violent that it became a third combatant. Winter temperatures plunged to 30 below zero, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The volcanic terrain featured no roads, limited beaches suitable for landing, and mountains that could hide defenders indefinitely. Conducting modern warfare here would be like fighting on the moon, except the moon didn't have weather that could kill you in minutes. But King had no choice. By August 1942, American forces began the slow, painful process of building up for a counteroffensive. Engineers carved airfields from tundra on Adak Island, just 200 miles from Japanese-held Kiska. Bombers began pounding enemy positions through the fog whenever visibility allowed. The question wasn't whether to retake Attu and Kiska, but how many men it would cost and what lessons their sacrifice would teach the world's next great amphibious invasions. What the planners didn't yet understand was that the Japanese had turned both islands into fortified nightmares, and the American force preparing to assault them had never fought together, never trained for Arctic warfare, and was about to learn lessons in amphibious combat that would be written in blood. By March 1943, Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the North Pacific Force and faced a problem that kept him awake at night. Intelligence estimated 2,500 Japanese defenders on Attu dug into positions that had been fortified for 9 months. The island was 35 miles long and 15 miles wide, roughly half the size of Okinawa, but far more defensible. 3 mountain ridges rising over 2,000 feet dominated the landscape, with only 2 viable landing beaches at Massacre Bay and Holtz Bay on opposite sides of the island. Kinkaid's plan was audacious and risky. He would split his assault force, landing the 7th Infantry Division's southern force at Massacre Bay and a smaller northern force at Holtz Bay simultaneously. The 2 forces would advance inland, trap the Japanese garrison between them, and crush resistance within 3 days. On paper, the arithmetic looked favorable. 3,000 attackers against 2,500 defenders, with overwhelming naval and air superiority. The 7th Infantry Division had trained in the California Desert for the North Africa campaign, but was redirected to the Aleutians with virtually no cold weather preparation. The division's commander, Major General Albert Brown, recognized the deficiencies but couldn't fix them in time. His soldiers had never conducted amphibious landings, never fought in sub-freezing temperatures, and many had never fired their weapons in combat. Their equipment was designed for desert warfare. Leather boots that would freeze solid, cotton uniforms that would soak through and rob body heat, and standard-issue rifles prone to jamming in Arctic conditions. Medics carried bandages and morphine, but no guidelines for treating the frostbite that would incapacitate more men than Japanese bullets. The naval component was equally improvised. Kinkaid assembled a task force of 3 battleships, 6 cruisers, 19 destroyers, and transport ships that had never worked together. The pre-invasion bombardment would be massive, but untargeted gunners would simply saturate suspected positions through the fog, hoping to suppress defenders they couldn't see. No one had solved the problem of how to provide close air support when clouds sat at 50 feet for days at a time. Intelligence was fragmentary and often wrong. Photo reconnaissance missions returned with images of grey fog over grey rock, occasionally revealing buildings or bunker entrances, but never the full defensive network. The Americans estimated Japanese strength at 2,500, which proved accurate. What they missed was how those 2,500 men had transformed Attu into a fortress. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki commanded the Japanese garrison with grim determination. He understood that relief would never come. The Imperial Navy had written off the Aleutians after Midway, but his orders were clear: make the Americans pay for every yard. His engineers carved bunkers into reverse slopes, where naval gunfire couldn't reach them. They fortified natural caves, created interlocking fields of fire, and positioned heavy machine guns to cover every approach. Supplies were stockpiled for a siege that everyone knew would end only one way. Yamasaki's greatest weapon wasn't firepower but terrain. The mountains funneled attackers into kill zones. The tundra, alternately frozen solid or knee-deep in mud, made maneuver nearly impossible, and the weather would do more damage than bullets ever could. On May 4, 1943, the American convoy departed Cold Bay, Alaska, carrying 15,000 soldiers, 3,000 for the initial assault, the rest in reserve. The men had been issued what cold weather gear the supply system could provide: wool overcoats, some rubber boots, and gloves that would prove inadequate. They understood they were heading into combat but couldn't imagine the environment they were about to enter. Admiral Kinkaid issued final orders with an edge of concern in his voice. The plan assumed good weather, rapid advances, and quick victory. If anything went wrong, if the fog rolled in, if resistance was heavier than expected, if the mountains proved more difficult than anticipated, there was no contingency plan except to keep attacking. The question wasn't whether the Americans would retake Attu. With overwhelming numbers and firepower, the outcome was mathematically certain. The real question was how many men would be lost taking an island that barely mattered, and whether anyone back home would even remember their names. If you're still with us through this frozen battlefield, let me know in the comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time. Don't miss the untold stories of World War II. May 11th, 1943, 0400 hours. The first wave hits the beach at Massacre Bay and encounters no resistance. Men stumble out of landing craft onto grey sand and frozen tundra, weapons ready, but no bullets fly. The silence is eerie and disorienting. Colonel Edward Earle's Southern Force, 2,000 soldiers from the 17th Infantry Regiment, spreads across the beach, expecting ambush at any moment. None comes. Within an hour, the entire force is ashore and beginning the advance inland toward the mountains 3 miles away. Then the terrain takes over. What looked like flat tundra from the landing craft is actually an endless series of hummocks, water-filled depressions, and moss that hides knee-deep mud. Each step is a battle against ground that seems designed to trap soldiers. Men carrying 70-pound packs sink to their thighs, exhausting themselves before they've advanced 100 yards. Radio equipment disappears into murky water. Mortars meant to provide fire support bog down and have to be abandoned. The advance that planners expected to cover in hours takes an entire day to move 2 miles. At 1,600 hours, the Southern Force reaches the base of Jarmin Pass, a gap in the mountains that leads to the valley beyond. Here, Colonel Yamasaki springs his trap. Heavy machine guns open up from bunkers carved into the mountainside, invisible until they fire. Mortars drop shells with precision on the exposed Americans below. Suddenly, the landscape transforms from obstacle into killing ground. Lieutenant John Campbell's company takes the first serious casualties. Men fall in the tundra, some killed instantly, others wounded and unable to move in the freezing mud. Medics trying to reach them come under fire. The Americans return fire at positions they can't see, their .30 caliber machine guns chattering against rock and dirt, while the Japanese remain safe in reinforced bunkers. Within 30 minutes, Campbell's company has lost 15% of its strength and hasn't advanced a single yard. Colonel Earle orders a withdrawal to reassess. His men pull back toward the beach as fog rolls in, reducing visibility to 20 feet. In the chaos, squads become separated. Some soldiers wander into the tundra and simply vanish, whether killed by Japanese patrols, victims of exposure, or lost in the fog. No one ever determines. The first day's casualties are light by Pacific War standards, roughly 40 killed and wounded, but the psychological impact is devastating. The men realize they're not just fighting an enemy, they're fighting geography itself. At Holt's Bay, on the northern coast, the story is similar but worse. The Northern Force, 500 soldiers from the Scout Battalion, lands against minimal resistance and begins advancing through a valley toward the high ground. Japanese defenders let them penetrate inland, then cut them off. Suddenly, the Scout Battalion is surrounded, taking fire from positions on 3 sides, with only a narrow beach at their back. Casualties mount rapidly. The unit's commander radios for reinforcement and gets a grim response. No reserves available, hold your position. As darkness falls on May 11th, the American commanders take stock. Both landing forces are ashore but pinned down, having advanced far less than planned while taking steady casualties. The pre-invasion naval bombardment had been impressive, over 800 rounds of 14-inch shells, but missed the Japanese bunkers entirely because gunners couldn't see through the fog. Air support never materialized because weather grounded every plane, and the cold is becoming a serious problem. Men who got wet during the landing are showing signs of hypothermia. Sentries on overnight watch develop frostbite in their fingers and toes. Medics report soldiers shivering uncontrollably, despite wearing every piece of clothing they possess. Admiral Kincaid's 3-day estimate is already looking optimistic. The Americans control 2 narrow beachheads and nothing else. The Japanese control the high ground, the interior, and the initiative. And the weather forecast calls for more fog, more cold, and no improvement for at least a week. The question now is whether the Americans can adapt fast enough to keep men alive while figuring out how to crack positions that naval guns can't reach and bombers can't see, because every hour spent pinned down means more. Soldiers lost to an enemy that never sleeps and never gets cold. May 12th through May 16th, 1943. The Battle of Attu transforms into something no American planner anticipated, a First World War-style siege fought in Arctic conditions. The Southern force spends 4 days trying to advance through Jarmin Pass and gains exactly 600 yards. Each attempt follows the same pattern. Infantry charges uphill through tundra that turns ankle in every step. Machine gun fire cuts down the lead elements. Survivors pull back, call for artillery support that mostly misses because forward observers can't see targets through fog, then try again. The daily casualty count grows. 15 dead here, 30 wounded there, numbers that seem small until they accumulate. But the real enemy isn't Japanese machine guns, it's the environment working in concert with them. Soldiers quickly learn that wet clothing equals death. Sweat from climbing mountains soaks through cotton uniforms, then freezes when men stop moving. Leather boots become rigid blocks of ice that cut off circulation to feet. Frostbite casualties begin exceeding combat casualties. Medics establish aid stations behind the lines where they treat cases ranging from superficial white, numb fingertips to severe, black, gangrenous toes that require amputation. By May 14th, over 300 men have been evacuated for cold injuries, nearly 10% of the assault force. The soldiers develop survival techniques through trial and error. They learn to carry extra socks and change them frequently, wringing out the wet pair and warming it against their skin. They learn to keep moving, always moving, because standing still invites hypothermia. They learn that touching metal with bare skin in sub-freezing temperatures means instant injury. And they learn that in fog so dense, whole squads vanish in the wrong direction, fighting both the enemy and the elements. Colonel Earl, commanding the Southern force, faces a tactical nightmare. His men are brave and willing, but inexperience shows in every engagement. Platoons bunch together during advances, making perfect targets for Japanese mortars. Soldiers fire wildly at suspected positions, wasting ammunition. Communication breaks down because radio operators can't keep equipment dry and functioning. At one point, an entire company spends 2 hours pinned down by fire from what turns out to be a single Japanese machine gun team, 4 men who had found the perfect position and used it brilliantly. The Northern force at Holt's Bay fights a different battle: survival. Still cut off and surrounded, the Scout Battalion holds a perimeter barely 500 yards deep. Japanese probing attacks come every night, preventing sleep and slowly grinding down the defenders. Wounded soldiers can't be evacuated because the beaches are under fire. Supplies run low. On May 14th, a supply drop goes wrong when parachutes fail and crates smash on the rocks, destroying desperately needed ammunition and food. But the Americans have one decisive advantage: overwhelming firepower once they can identify targets. On May 15th, the fog lifts for 3 hours, the longest clear period since the invasion. Immediately, Navy destroyers close to shore and begin systematic destruction of visible Japanese positions. Their 5-inch guns hammer bunkers with direct fire at ranges under 3,000 yards. Simultaneously, P-38 fighters appear and strafe defensive lines with 50 caliber rounds. The effect is devastating. Japanese positions that had held for days are obliterated in minutes. When the fog returns, the Americans have finally cracked the first defensive line at Jarmin Pass. The breakthrough costs. The 17th Infantry Regiment has lost over 200 men killed and wounded, plus another 400 evacuated for frostbite and exposure. That's 600 casualties, 30% of the regiment's strength to advance barely a mile. At this rate, securing the island will take not 3 days but 3 weeks, and the division will be combat ineffective long before victory. General Brown, observing from his command ship, makes the difficult decision to commit his reserves. On May 16th, the 32nd Infantry Regiment lands at Massacre Bay, adding fresh troops to the assault. The plan is to bypass the remaining defences at Jarmin Pass, push through the mountains to the west, and attack the main Japanese positions from an unexpected direction. It's a bold maneuver that depends on speed, surprise, and soldiers somehow maintaining combat effectiveness while marching through mountains in conditions that have already proven devastating. What General Brown doesn't know is that Colonel Yamasaki is making his own calculations. The Japanese commander has lost perhaps 400 men killed and wounded out of his original garrison of 2,500. He's down to perhaps 2,000 effectives, running low on ammunition, and facing a force that now outnumbers him at least 6-1. Relief isn't coming. Resupply isn't coming. The only question is how much longer to delay the inevitable. Yamasaki decides the answer is, until the last man. He orders his troops to fight from every position until overrun, then fall back to the next defensive line. No retreats, no surrenders. Just maximum attrition inflicted on the Americans at minimum cost to Japanese honor. It's a brutal calculus, but one that aligns with his orders and his code. The Americans will take Attu, but they'll take it one bloody foot at a time. The question is whether the Americans can maintain their offensive before the frozen mountains break their army, because in this war within a war, cold kills as efficiently as bullets, and the enemy that never rests is the one you can't shoot. May 17th through May 21st, 1943. The reinforced American force launches a coordinated push that finally breaks the Japanese defensive system, but at a cost that shocks even hardened commanders. The 32nd Infantry Regiment executes its flanking maneuver through the mountains, a march that one survivor will later describe as harder than any combat he experienced. Men climb slopes at 40-degree angles while carrying full combat loads. They wade through streams of snowmelt that freeze their legs numb. They navigate in fog so thick that the soldier in front is barely visible. The march takes 18 hours to cover 6 miles, and by the time the regiment reaches its attack position, 15% of its strength has collapsed from exhaustion or cold injury. But the maneuver works. On May 18th, the 32nd attacks Japanese positions from the flank, just as the 17th Infantry resumes its frontal assault through Jarmin Pass. Caught between two forces, the Japanese defensive line finally cracks. The Americans advance 2 miles in a single day, more progress than in the previous week combined, and capture the village of Holtz, one of the 2 populated areas on the island. The victory is bittersweet. American casualties for the day total 91 killed and over 200 wounded. Medics work frantically in aid stations, treating gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and the ever-present frostbite. Morphine supplies run low. Whole blood for transfusions is in short supply because cold weather makes storage difficult. Men die from wounds that would be survivable in a hospital, but prove fatal in frozen aid stations miles from the nearest ship. The Northern Force, surrounded at Holtz Bay for over a week, finally gets relief when the 32nd Infantry punches through to their position. The Scout Battalion has lost 40% of its strength, some killed, more wounded, many evacuated for cold injuries but held their perimeter against odds that should have destroyed them. When relief arrives, some survivors are so exhausted they can barely walk. Others are still fighting, still defiant, proving that courage and training can overcome terrible circumstances if men refuse to quit. By May 20th, the Americans control roughly 2/3 of Attu. The Japanese have been compressed into the island's eastern end, centered around Chichagof Harbor, where their original headquarters stood. Colonel Yamasaki has perhaps 1,500 effectives left, ammunition for perhaps 3 more days of heavy fighting, and no hope whatsoever. His orders are to delay as long as possible. What he decides instead is to attack. The decision makes perfect military sense within Japanese doctrine of the time. A final assault, a coordinated strike designed to inflict maximum casualties before inevitable defeat, would honor the code of Bushido, kill more Americans, and possibly break their will to continue the offensive. Yamasaki begins planning the largest coordinated Japanese counterattack in the Aleutian campaign, scheduled for the early morning hours of May 29th. American intelligence picks up signs something is coming. Captured documents mention an attack. Japanese radio traffic increases, but the Americans don't grasp the scale of what Yamasaki is planning. 1,000-man assault straight into American lines. Every soldier committed, no reserves held back. Success measured not in ground taken, but in enemies killed before death. On May 21st, the Americans pause their offensive to consolidate gains and rest troops who are near their breaking point. General Brown's after-action reports describe soldiers who have been in continuous combat for 10 days in sub-freezing weather with minimal sleep, inadequate food, and constant stress. Psychiatric casualties are mounting men who simply break down, or stare at nothing, or refuse to leave their foxholes, even when ordered. The division psychiatrist coins a new term, battle fatigue aggravated by environmental stress. In plain language, the cold and fog are driving men to their limits as efficiently as combat. The strategic picture is clearing. The Americans will win, that's no longer in doubt, but the price is already shocking. Casualty figures, as of May 21st, show roughly 400 Americans killed, over 1,000 wounded, and 800 evacuated for cold injuries. That's 2,200 casualties, nearly a third of the assault force, with fighting still ahead. The casualty rate is approaching that of major battles in Europe, on an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. What no one yet understands is that the worst is still coming, and it will arrive not through gradual attrition, but in one terrible night, when desperate men make a final charge that will be remembered as one of the Pacific War's most savage close-quarters battles. May 29th, 1943. 0330 hours. Engineers Hill, the forward American position overlooking Chichagof Valley, erupts in chaos as over 1,000 Japanese soldiers burst from the fog and charge straight into stunned American defenders. The attack hits a battalion of the 32nd Infantry Regiment that was expecting quiet dawn. Men are still in sleeping bags, weapons not immediately at hand, positions not fully manned. Within seconds, the assault overruns foxholes and defensive positions, leaving wounded men in desperate fights for survival. Private Joseph Martinez from the 32nd Infantry's Company K will later receive the Medal of Honor posthumously for what happens in the next 5 minutes. Stationed at an outpost forward of the main line, Martinez sees the charge coming and opens fire with his Browning automatic rifle, cutting down lead elements even as hundreds more pour through the fog behind them. He holds his position alone for nearly 10 minutes, burning through magazine after magazine, killing an estimated dozen attackers before he falls. His stand gives the main line seconds to react, seconds that mean the difference between an organized defense and complete collapse. Across the American position, individual soldiers and small units fight desperate point-blank battles. Sergeant Frank Clemens rallies his squad and establishes a makeshift defensive line using medical tents as cover. Private Harold Wees, a medic, treats wounded even as attackers close within 10 feet, refusing to abandon casualties. In several places, the fighting devolves into hand-to-hand combat, rifles swung as clubs, knives and bayonets, men grappling in mud and blood. The assault is not a mindless rush, it's coordinated chaos with specific objectives. One prong attacks the American aid station, attempting to eliminate medical supplies. Another targets the artillery positions, hoping to capture American guns. A third drives straight at the headquarters area, hoping to kill officers and break command structure. Colonel Yamasaki leads from the front, sword drawn, personally directing the assault until he falls to American fire somewhere in the darkness. For 90 minutes, the battle rages with intensity that surpasses anything previously seen in the Aleutian campaign. American defensive fire becomes so heavy that machine gun barrels glow red. Artillery crews fire over open sights at ranges under 100 yards, turning their howitzers into giant shotguns loaded with high explosive. Naval destroyers offshore fire star shells to illuminate the battlefield, turning night into flickering daylight, where silhouettes run and rise and fall again. Slowly, inevitably, American firepower wins. By 0500 hours, the charge has stalled. Japanese survivors withdraw into the fog, leaving hundreds of fallen on the slopes. The Americans count their own casualties in shock, over 500 killed, wounded, and missing from a single battalion. The aid station has been overrun and then retaken. Men who couldn't be evacuated faced desperate circumstances. Artillery positions are littered with fallen attackers who came within feet of success. The headquarters area held only because a cook Private James Wright organized mess personnel into an improvised defensive line and held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Dawn on May 29th reveals a battlefield unlike anything American soldiers have encountered. The slopes of Engineers Hill are covered with fallen over 500 in some estimates, but mixed among them are American casualties in numbers that turn veterans pale. The assault killed more Americans in 90 minutes than the previous 2 weeks of combat combined. And in the aid stations and medical tents, surgeons work on the wounded amid scenes that test the limits of medical training and human endurance. Yet the charge accomplished something beyond the tactical. It broke the last organized Japanese resistance. Survivors, perhaps 400 effectives, scattered into the mountains with no supplies, no ammunition, and no orders. Over the next 3 days, American patrols find them individually or in small groups. Most refuse surrender and fall in brief firefights. Some choose death by their own hand rather than face capture. A handful, approximately 29 soldiers, surrender, becoming among the few Japanese troops in the Pacific War to do so in 1943. On June 1, 1943, the Battle of Attu is declared over. American casualties total 550 killed in action, over 1,100 wounded, and more than 1,200 evacuated for cold injuries and disease, nearly 3,000 casualties from an assault force of barely 10,000. Japanese casualties are virtually total. All 2,500 defenders killed or captured, with only the 29 prisoners surviving. The ratio tells a stark story of modern firepower meeting determined resistance in terrain that magnified both. The statistics mask the human cost. Companies that landed at Massacre Bay with 150 men finish with 60. The 32nd Infantry Regiment loses over half its strength. Platoons are combined because no platoon has enough survivors to function independently, and even the survivors are changed. Later examinations show that over 70% of soldiers who fought on Attu suffer from frostbite damage to fingers or toes, cold injuries that will affect them for life. But the battle yields lessons that will save thousands of lives in battles to come. American planners learn that amphibious assaults require specialized training, proper equipment, and realistic casualty estimates. They learn that cold weather warfare demands as much preparation as jungle warfare. They learn that naval gunfire bombardment needs forward observers who can actually see targets, that air support in bad weather is useless, and that logistical planning must account for environmental casualties as seriously as combat casualties. Perhaps most importantly, the Aleutian campaign proves that small islands defended by determined enemies cannot be taken quickly or cheaply, no matter how overwhelming American material superiority appears on paper. This lesson, paid for in blood on frozen tundra, will inform planning for every subsequent amphibious operation from Tarawa to Okinawa. The question now is whether those lessons came soon enough to matter for the battles already being planned across the Pacific, and whether the soldiers who bought them with their lives will ever receive the recognition they earned. While American forces recover from Attu, attention shifts to Kiska, the other Japanese-occupied island 170 miles to the east. Intelligence estimates place the garrison at over 5,000 troops, more than twice. Attu's strength occupying positions fortified for over a year. Given what just happened at Attu, American planners expect Kiska to be exponentially worse. Higher casualties, longer battle, possibly a month of combat in the same brutal conditions. The invasion force assembled for Kiska dwarfs the Attu operation. 34,000 American and Canadian troops prepare to land, supported by a fleet of nearly 100 ships. The force includes the 7th Infantry Division, now veterans of Attu, but still recovering from losses, plus fresh units that trained specifically for Arctic warfare. Equipment is better. Rubber-bottomed boots that insulate against cold, layered clothing systems, weapons tested in freezing temperatures. Planners build in longer timelines, larger casualty estimates, and extensive support infrastructure. For 2 months leading up to the invasion, Navy and Army Air Force planes pound Kiska relentlessly. Over 1,000 bomber sorties drop thousands of tons of explosives on suspected positions. Ships shell the island from offshore. The bombardment is so intense that American commanders believe they're destroying the garrison through attrition, softening resistance before the landing. But something strange is happening. Photo reconnaissance shows no movement on Kiska. Radio intercepts detect no Japanese communications. The few Japanese messages picked up by American intelligence seem old, possibly recordings. Patrols from submarines that approach the shore at night report no visible activity, no lights, nothing indicating an occupied garrison. Yet the possibility that Japan abandoned Kiska seems impossible. Abandoning 5,000 troops would be a massive evacuation requiring dozens of ships, impossible to hide from American air reconnaissance. Intelligence analysts debate. Some argue the Japanese are lying low, waiting to ambush the landing force. Others suggest they've withdrawn into bunkers so deep that aerial bombardment can't reach them. A minority opinion holds that Kiska might actually be abandoned, but this view is dismissed as wishful thinking. The Attu experience proved that Japanese forces don't retreat, they fight to the last man. Kiska will be the same, only worse. But what if the impossible had actually happened? August 15th, 1943. The invasion fleet arrives off Kiska in thick fog, landing craft lower away from transports and head toward beaches through limited visibility. 34,000 soldiers prepare for what many expect to be the bloodiest battle of the Aleutian campaign. Naval guns begin final bombardment, planes strafe visible targets, and at 0630 hours, the first wave hits the beach. They encounter nothing, no machine gun fire, no mortars, no artillery. The soldiers advance inland warily, weapons ready, but no resistance materializes. They push through abandoned defensive positions, bunkers still stocked with ammunition, artillery pieces left intact, buildings showing signs of recent occupation but no occupants. Patrols penetrate deep into the interior and find absolutely no one. Over the course of the day, the truth emerges. Japan evacuated Kiska's entire garrison under cover of fog on July 28, nearly 3 weeks before the American invasion. In a brilliantly executed operation, Japanese cruisers and destroyers sneaked into Kiska harbor, loaded all 5,100 troops and equipment, and disappeared into the North Pacific without American forces detecting the evacuation. The invasion of Kiska, planned with painful lessons from Attu, proceeded against an island that had been abandoned for weeks. The operation isn't bloodless. Over 2 days, friendly fire incidents and booby traps killed 24 American and Canadian soldiers and wound 50 more. In the fog, American units mistake each other for Japanese and open fire. Soldiers trigger mines left behind by evacuating defenders. Some men die, falling off cliffs in limited visibility. The casualties are absurd, and tragic men killed invading an island where the enemy had already left. The Kiska operation becomes a strange footnote to the Aleutian campaign, a masterpiece of deception by Japan, a massive mobilization by America against an absent enemy, and a reminder that war includes not just dramatic battles, but also episodes of confusion and miscalculation. Yet even the bloodless invasion yields benefits. The training and equipment improvements made after Attu are validated. Amphibious techniques are refined, and over 30,000 soldiers gain experience in Arctic warfare and amphibious operations without casualties, experience they'll carry to future battles. By late August 1943, American forces control the entire Aleutian chain. The strategic threat to Alaska evaporates. Japan's brief occupation of American territory ends, and the Northern Pacific becomes a backwater theater where both sides maintain forces but neither seeks major combat. The Aleutian campaign is over, but the cost requires accounting. American casualties across the entire campaign total over 1,500 killed, over 4,000 wounded, and thousands more evacuated for cold injuries and disease. Equipment losses include dozens of aircraft and several ships. The monetary cost exceeds $300 million, a staggering sum for 1,943. And the campaign's duration, 15 months from Japanese occupation to final American victory, makes it one of the war's longest continuous operations. Japan's losses are even starker. Nearly the entire Attu garrison of 2,500 men died. Only successful evacuation saved Kiska's 5,000 troops from similar fate. The campaign tied down resources Japan could ill afford to lose, and achieved no strategic objectives whatsoever. The occupation of Attu and Kiska ranks among the Imperial Japanese military's least successful operations, a sideshow that consumed resources while contributing nothing to Japan's defensive position in the Pacific. The question is whether any of it mattered. whether the blood and treasure spent in the Aleutians changed anything beyond the lives of the men who fought there, because wars are ultimately judged not by battles won, but by strategic outcomes achieved. On Engineers Hill today, shallow depressions mark the foxholes where men froze and fought in May 1943. Their legacy still shapes military doctrine. The Aleutian campaign's influence on World War II exceeds its apparent strategic importance. While historians often dismiss it as a sideshow, and by most measures it was the battles fought on Attu and Kiska shaped American military doctrine in ways that resonated throughout the Pacific War and beyond. The amphibious assault on Attu was America's first opposed landing in the Pacific theater, occurring 16 months before D-Day and 7 months before Tarawa. Everything the Marines learned on Tarawa, the need for specialized landing craft, the importance of accurate naval gunfire, the requirement for extensive pre-landing reconnaissance, American soldiers learned first on Attu. The casualty rate at Attu, 30% over 19 days, exceeded even Tarawa's horrific losses when measured across the entire operation. Yet Attu taught lessons that would save lives at Tarawa, Saipan, and Normandy. Amphibious doctrine changed fundamentally because of Attu. The Navy developed specialized landing craft capable of operating in rough seas. Forward observer teams were integrated directly into assault units to coordinate naval gunfire with ground advances. Close air support procedures were redesigned to function even in limited visibility. Medical evacuation protocols were overhauled to account for environmental casualties. By the time Marines hit the beach at Tarawa in November 1943, procedures tested in blood on Attu had been incorporated into training and planning. Cold weather warfare doctrine emerged almost entirely from Aleutian experience. Before Attu, the American military had no systematic approach to Arctic combat. After Attu, entire training programs were created. The Army established cold weather training centers in Colorado, where soldiers learned techniques Attu veterans had discovered through trial and error. Layered clothing systems, proper nutrition for cold environments, recognition and treatment of hypothermia and frostbite, psychological preparation for fighting in extreme weather. These programs would prove invaluable not just in the Pacific but in the European theater, where American forces faced brutal winter conditions during the Battle of the Bulge. Equipment improvements accelerated because of failures observed in the Aleutians. The infamous leather boots that froze solid on Attu were replaced with insulated rubber-bottomed boots, bunny boots, that became standard issue for cold weather operations. Weapons were redesigned with different lubricants that didn't freeze. Tents and shelters were improved. Ration packs were reformulated to provide more calories for cold weather exertion. Every equipment category received scrutiny based on what worked and what failed on Attu. But perhaps the campaign's most important legacy was psychological. Attu proved that even well-trained American soldiers struggled against determined defenders in difficult terrain. The 3-day estimate for capturing Attu, which became 19 days of brutal combat, forced planners to abandon optimistic assumptions about rapid victory. Future amphibious assaults were planned with realistic casualty estimates and longer timelines. The can-do attitude that led to Attu's underestimation was tempered by respect for what defenders could achieve, even when outnumbered and outgunned. The Japanese learned different lessons, though fewer forces survived to apply them. The Banzai charge on Attu, while tactically successful in inflicting casualties, ultimately proved that massed frontal assaults against American firepower were suicidal. Yet Japanese commanders would order similar charges at Saipan, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller islands, each time with the same result: high American casualties followed by complete Japanese annihilation. Whether Japanese military culture could have absorbed Attu's lessons is debatable. The evidence suggests it could not. From a strategic perspective, the Aleutian campaign achieved its primary objective, removing Japanese forces from American territory and eliminating any threat to Alaska or the West Coast. The secondary objective, establishing bases for potential operations against Japan's northern flank, proved less valuable than hoped. The Aleutians' terrible weather and limited infrastructure made them poor staging areas. Ultimately, the American drive across the Central Pacific rendered the northern approach irrelevant. Yet strategy is only part of war's calculus. The men who fought on Attu and prepared to invade Kiska learned lessons about themselves, their equipment, and their enemy that no training exercise could teach. They learned that modern warfare could be as primitive as hand-to-hand combat in frozen mud. They learned that courage means continuing to advance when every rational instinct screams to take cover. They learned that logistics, food, ammunition, dry socks matters as much as tactics, and they learned that America could take casualties, absorb losses, and keep attacking until victory was achieved. The 7th Infantry Division, bloodied on Attu, went on to fight in the Marshall Islands, Leyte, and Okinawa. Many veterans of Attu served in subsequent campaigns, carrying lessons learned in the Aleutians to new battlefields. Their experience contributed to American success in ways that defy easy measurement but remain significant. A platoon sergeant who kept his men alive on Attu by enforcing strict cold-weather discipline would use those same leadership skills at Kwajalein. A company commander who learned to coordinate naval gunfire on Attu would apply that knowledge at Leyte Gulf. And the dead, the 550 Americans killed on Attu, plus nearly 1,000 more who died across the broader Aleutian campaign from combat, accidents, and disease, left a legacy measured not in territory won but in lessons purchased. Every battle of World War II contributed to ultimate victory, but some battles teach more than others. Attu was a teacher, brutal and unforgiving, whose classroom was frozen tundra and whose textbook was written in blood. Why did America forget its own frozen battlefield? While veterans of Normandy, Guadalcanal, and the Battle of the Bulge received extensive recognition, men who fought in the Aleutians returned home to find most Americans barely aware the battles had occurred. Several factors explain this historical amnesia. Timing played a role. The campaign peaked in mid-1943, when American attention was focused on victories in North Africa and preparations for the invasion of Italy. Attu's bloodiest fighting happened the same week as major operations elsewhere, and newspapers devoted more coverage to theaters that seemed more strategically significant. By the time the war ended, the Aleutian campaign was ancient history, overshadowed by dramatic battles that followed. Geography also contributed to obscurity. The Aleutian Islands are remote even by Alaska standards, a chain of volcanic rocks that few Americans could locate on a map. The battles occurred in fog so thick that combat photographers could barely capture useful images. The few photographs that emerged showed grey soldiers fighting on grey landscapes under grey skies, visually unimpressive, compared to the vivid imagery from tropical Pacific islands or European battlefields. Strategic narrative shaped memory as well. Military historians writing after the war focused on campaigns that clearly influenced the war's outcome. The island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific made strategic sense as a narrative. Each island brought America closer to Japan. The European theatre offered clear progression from North Africa through Italy to France and Germany. The Aleutian campaign fit neither pattern. It was a defensive operation to reclaim American territory, not an offensive to seize enemy ground. Its strategic value was primarily negative, preventing Japanese use of the islands rather than positive. The absence of dramatic hero narratives also limited public memory. While individual acts of courage on Attu earned medals, Private Martinez's posthumous Medal of Honor, several Distinguished Service Crosses, the battle produced no Audie Murphys, no larger-than-life figures whose stories would keep the campaign alive in popular memory. The fighting was heroic, but collectively so, performed by ordinary soldiers whose names never became famous. Yet, obscurity doesn't diminish significance. The men who fought in the Aleutians faced challenges as severe as anywhere in World War II. They fought an environment that killed as efficiently as enemy fire. They conducted amphibious operations under worse conditions than Normandy or Tarawa. They achieved victory despite inadequate training and equipment, and they contributed to America's ultimate triumph in ways both direct lessons learned and indirect proving American ability to project power even to the most remote battlefields. Today, few physical reminders of the campaign remain. The islands themselves show limited evidence of battle. Permafrost and volcanic activity have swallowed most installations. A few rusting Quonset huts dot the landscape. Unexploded ordnance still occasionally surfaces. The National Park Service maintains sites on Attu and Kiska as part of the World War II valor in the Pacific National Monument, but visitors are rare. Reaching the islands requires chartered flights or boats, and weather permits access only a few months per year. The battlefield on Attu remains largely as it was in 1943. Engineers Hill, where the Banzai Charge reached its climax, shows subtle traces if you know where to look. Depressions where foxholes were dug, slight irregularities where bunkers collapsed. Massacre Bay's beach is empty grey sand, giving no hint that thousands of soldiers once waded ashore expecting death. The mountains still funnel approaches just as they did when American infantry struggled through them step by frozen step. A memorial stands at Little Falls Cemetery on Attu, erected by the Japanese government in 1953 to honor their war dead. American veterans erected their own memorial years later. The two monuments stand within sight of each other, marking a battlefield where men who shared nothing except determination fought to the death over rocks that neither side particularly wanted. It's a fitting symbol for a forgotten campaign, two nations remembering the same battle, but few outside those nations knowing it occurred. The approximately 550 Americans killed on Attu rest in various cemeteries across the United States. The army repatriated remains after the war. The Japanese dead were never recovered. Their bones remain on Attu, scattered across the island they were ordered to defend. In a sense, Colonel Yamasaki achieved his goal. His garrison tied down American forces, inflicted significant casualties, and fought to the last man. That the strategic purpose was questionable, and the sacrifice ultimately meaningless, doesn't diminish the tactical accomplishment or the human cost. Yet memory fades. Why did America forget its own frozen battlefield? What did America achieve in the Aleutian campaign, and was it worth the price? The question admits no easy answer, but the accounting deserves examination. The strategic balance sheet shows mixed results. On the positive side, American forces reclaimed U.S. territory, eliminated a potential threat to Alaska, and denied Japan any northern bases from which to threaten the West Coast or interdict Lend-Lease shipping to the Soviet Union. The campaign also tied down Japanese resources, ships, planes, troops that might have reinforced defensive positions in the Central or South Pacific, though Japan's decision to occupy the islands was voluntary and their continued presence there a strategic error. On the negative side, the campaign consumed American resources at a prodigious rate. Over 1,500 Americans died, roughly 4,000 were wounded, and thousands more suffered cold injuries or disease. The monetary cost exceeded $300 million in 1943 currency, over $5 billion in current terms. The forces committed to the Aleutians at peak, over 100,000 American personnel, could have reinforced other theaters. Every ship, plane and soldier in the Aleutians was unavailable for operations against Japan's main defensive perimeter. Yet focusing purely on strategic arithmetic misses the campaign's real significance. The Aleutian campaign served as America's testing ground for amphibious warfare and Arctic operations. The lessons learned on Attu influenced every subsequent amphibious landing in the Pacific and Europe. Equipment failures identified in the Aleutians drove improvements that saved lives in later battles. Training deficiencies exposed on Attu led to programs that better prepared soldiers for combat. In this sense, the campaign functioned as an expensive but invaluable learning experience. Consider the counterfactual. What if America's first opposed amphibious landing had been Tarawa instead of Attu? The Marines who hit the beach at Tarawa benefited from procedures and equipment tested in the Aleutians. Without those lessons, Tarawa's casualty rate, already horrific, might have been worse. By the time Marines landed at Saipan in June 1944, American amphibious doctrine reflected a year of improvements rooted in Aleutian experience. The cost of learning on Attu may have saved lives at Normandy. The human cost deserves particular attention. The men who fought in the Aleutians were not volunteers for a prestigious campaign. They were ordinary soldiers assigned to what most considered a backwater. They endured conditions as harsh as anywhere in the war, fighting an enemy who never surrendered and an environment that never relented. That they achieved victory despite inadequate preparation speaks to their determination and adaptability. Many Attu veterans carried physical and psychological scars for life. Cold injuries left permanent damage, fingers with reduced sensation, toes lost to frostbite, circulation problems that would worsen with age. Psychological trauma from the battle manifested in nightmares, anxiety, and what we now recognize as PTSD, but was then dismissed or insufficiently treated. The Banzai Charge survivors, in particular, struggled with memories of close-quarters combat that broke through defensive lines. Yet many veterans also carried pride in their service. They had fought in America's first offensive amphibious operation in the Pacific. They had endured conditions that would have broken lesser men. They had proven that American soldiers could fight and win anywhere on Earth, against any enemy, under any circumstances. This pride sustained them through post-war years, when few people knew where Attu was or why it mattered. The campaign's influence extended beyond immediate tactical lessons. American strategic thinking shifted after the Aleutians. The expectation of quick, cheap victories gave way to realistic assessment of what island warfare cost. The understanding that geography and weather could multiply difficulty forced better planning. The recognition that even well-trained troops needed specialized preparation for unusual environments led to comprehensive training programs. Japan's strategic errors in the Aleutians also taught lessons to American observers, if not to Japanese commanders. The decision to occupy Attu and Kiska divided Japanese forces without achieving commensurate strategic benefit. The defense of Attu, while tactically impressive, resulted in complete destruction of the garrison with minimal impact on American offensive capability. Japanese willingness to sacrifice troops for marginal objectives presaged the island-by-island attrition that would characterize the Pacific War's final 2 years. From the perspective of total war strategy, the Aleutian campaign was perhaps inevitable. Once Japan occupied American territory, political pressure demanded its recapture regardless of strategic calculus. The campaign's cost high but manageable was affordable for an industrial power mobilizing its full capacity. The strategic distraction it caused was real but not crippling, and the lessons learned proved valuable beyond the immediate theater. In the final analysis, the Aleutian campaign was neither America's finest hour nor its worst mistake. It was a necessary operation, poorly prepared initially but executed with increasing competence, that achieved its objectives at acceptable cost while generating valuable lessons. The men who fought there deserved better recognition than they received, but their service contributed to ultimate victory in ways both measurable and intangible. Was the Aleutian campaign a necessary sacrifice or a costly distraction? Tell us what you think. The forgotten war in the frozen islands mattered. The men who fought there earned their place in history, and Attu deserves to be remembered alongside Normandy and Guadalcanal as a battle where American soldiers proved their worth under the worst possible conditions, even if the ice and fog have long since swallowed the evidence of their sacrifice. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share one thing you already knew about this story. Your thoughts are important to us, so don't hesitate to share them. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.